Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library. I'm here with one of my very favorite speakers, David Kruh. If you've ever heard him speak before, and I think we just went through all of his previous programs, we've heard him speak at least twice a year for the last 3 years, and he's amazing. So you're gonna have a great time tonight. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as he talks about the great fires of Boston. I am going to turn the chat off during his slides, but I will turn it back on so you can chat with each other when we go through the Q&A. But if you have questions for David, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. David is an author and a historian. He talks about many, many different topics, and he is unfailingly fascinating. David, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Mina, and good evening, everybody, to all. Let me look at that. Wow, 213 of you. That's terrific. So, well, were I standing in front of you, I would ask for a show of hands for how many Sparks we have in the audience and how many Jakes we have in the audience. So, a Spark is somebody who is not a firefighter or in the fire services, but is very interested. Maybe is one of those folks who rides around in their car with a scanner and goes to the fires, maybe takes pictures. And Jake's would be the firefighters themselves. And there's a lot of reasons why they're called Jake's. Maybe after the show, we can talk about that. But what I'd like to do is to take you through this history of the Great Fires of Boston. So we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning of the town, which had been settled in 1630 by those 30 settlers who came across from Charlestown in search of fresh water. The town was only 1 year old when it enacted the first fire prevention ordinance, and that banned thatched roofs and wooden chimneys. But by 1653, Boston, which had been founded for religious purposes, as we know, the Puritans were taking a beating back in England, but Boston was turning into a pretty busy seaport. And in this 1640 map, we can see the clusters of buildings that are today the North End and what was then called Town Cove, which was for many years the center of shipping for the colonies, in fact, for all of North America. On January 14th, 1653, the first of Boston's great fires destroyed 1/3 of the town and resulted in the deaths of 3 children who could not escape from their houses. The day after the fire, Boston drew up ordinances, quote, that every homeowner will have a ladder, a 12-foot pole with a large swab at the end to quench fires, iron crooks with chains which are ready in case of a fire, and that the selectmen shall provide 6 good and large ladders for the town's use, which shall hang outside the town meeting house. Now, since colonial buildings were constructed of light, flimsy materials, these tools could be used to pull down buildings, creating a separation or a fire break to prevent the spread of fire. The town even passed an ordinance giving it the right to tear down homes and buildings. Other ordinances forbade the lighting of fires on certain parts of town after 9 o'clock, as well as the first anti-smoking ordinance I could find, which prevented people from smoking inside the townhouse. About 3 decades later, on November 27th, 1676, a fire destroyed 46 homes and other buildings in the North End, including Increase Mather's home and church, as well as Paul Revere's first home. For this great fire, it is the first time gunpowder is used to blow up buildings to create those fire breaks. But it was a rainstorm and a change in wind direction that actually allowed the fire to be brought under control. So, a month later, the town drew up another planning ordinance when it decreed that streets in the burnt out district here in the North End would be straightened and widened. I've always thought that was kind of funny. Anyone who's been to the North End, like that's their idea of straightened and widened. But Hanover, for example, was widened to 22 feet, and many buildings on either side were taken by eminent domain. 3 years later, 1679, another devastating fire caused, quote, the most woeful destruction that Boston ever saw. It leveled 80 homes and 70 warehouses near the harbor, as well as lighting several ships at the docks on fire before it burned itself out 12 hours later. As a result, Boston again passed regulations. This is going to get a little repetitive here, gang. They passed regulations requiring that new buildings be constructed of stone or brick with slate roofs to prevent the spread of fire. But the following May, a petition signed by many citizens who complained that they were unable to afford to make the changes to their homes, and the law was suspended. On October 2nd, 1711, Boston suffered its eighth big fire in 60 years. It started apparently by a woman who was burning rubbish in a tenement backyard near Cornhill, over by the first meeting house. This was truly deserving of the title Great Fire because it destroyed nearly 1/3 of Boston, burned down 100 buildings, homes, and businesses from School Street all the way down to Dock Square, as well as the upper parts of King and Queen Streets, what we today call Court Street. 110 families lost their homes, and the townhouse was also destroyed in the fire that was witnessed by 6-year-old Benjamin Franklin. The fire of 1711 led to the enforcement of laws requiring that buildings, here I go again, be built with brick and slate roofs. A new town and colony house were built of brick, as well as new houses and shops on Cornhill and Washington Street. The old corner bookstore was one of those buildings built as a result of the ordinances requiring brick construction. The fire also led to the creation of what's called mutual fire societies. That meant when fire struck a member of the Mutual Fire Society, other members of the club were obligated to help battle the blaze. By 1715, there were 6 fire companies in Boston, each with their own engines. And I like to say that neither New York nor Philadelphia had even one at the time. Now, the Great Fire of 1711 had another unintended effect. The rubble from the destroyed buildings, remember, this is like 1/3 of the town, were used to fill in Long Wharf, which became the center of New England commerce for the rest of the century. So today, when you head out to the Chart House, you're actually walking on bits of Boston from before 1711. The Great Fire of 1747 would burn the interior of the new old State House on December 9th. The exterior walls survived, and those are the walls of the building today. On January 13th, 1762, another fire roared through the dock area, consumed over 350 buildings, including the interior of Peter Faneuil's 20-year-old building, which he had made a gift to the town. Just like with the townhouse, the exterior walls survived, and they're part of the building we know today. An April 24th, 1787 fire, starting in either a malt house on Beach Street or the Hollis Street Church, eventually took down more than 100 buildings through the neck, 60 of them homes. This was the first fire to which Boston's then volunteer fire department used hand-pumped engines. This map shows Boston during this era. There would be one more, quote, great fire of the century in 1794, one in which rope walks, stores, and homes from Pearl Street down to the water were burned to the ground. And small fires continued to break out in Boston. Things got so bad in 1803 that the town meeting requested from the General Court of Massachusetts that they pass a law requiring that any building above 10 feet high, that's really one story, be built of stone or brick and be covered with slate, tile, or some other non combustible material. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Anyway, in 1824, a fire that originated near the corner of Charles and Chestnut Streets would spread to Beacon Street and level 16 buildings. 50 stores were burned in Central and Kilby Streets in another fire, and 10 more buildings on Court Street, mostly lawyers who practice in the courthouse, were destroyed in 1832. But Boston, as susceptible to fire as it was, continued to grow and prosper in the years leading up to the Civil War. Changes were afoot, though, as waves of Irish immigrants began to change the character of parts of the city and provide a workforce for manufacturing. By 1860, Boston was a crowded city of brick and granite buildings, as we can see in this very famous photograph. It is the first aerial view of a city, taken from a balloon over the heart of the business district. Many of these 5 to 7 story buildings were faced with granite or cast iron, but their mansard roofs and floors and walls were made of wood. Even the elevator shaft were made of wood, something which would have grave consequences. Interesting that in 1867, Fire Chief John Darnell asked for control over the construction of new buildings and the alteration of old ones, but the city turned him down. 12 years after the 1860 photo was taken, every building within those streets, down to and including the docks, would be destroyed in the biggest fire to strike Boston and one of the biggest to strike any American city. At 7:24 on the evening of November 9th, 1872, Patrolman John Page was strolling his beat along Summer Street and glanced at this 4-story warehouse at the corner of Kingston and Summer. Just then, the roof exploded into flames as a fountain of blazing hoop skirts cascaded into the air. Imagine that sight. He sounded an alarm from the famous Box 52 at the corner of Bedford Street. According to Jane Holtz Kay, by the time the first fire engines arrived, the building was an inferno, and sparks and shoots of dry goods leaped across Summer Street, then Otis, then across the mansard roofs north and northwest, fed by prevailing winds. At Franklin and Hawley, the building that housed the Boston Pilot went up like it was made of matches. Experts, I'm holding up my fingers doing the air quote thing, well, they said, what happened in Chicago 2 years early, last year, 1871? That was their great fire. Couldn't happen here in Boston, since our buildings were made of solid, incombustible New England granite. But the interiors of those buildings, as I mentioned, they were still made of wood, and much of the goods stored inside those buildings, from those hoop skirts to barrels, were highly combustible. And the buildings were so close together that the fire found an easy route across the roofs. There were other factors that contributed to the fire getting completely out of control. There was a horse epidemic, a flu epidemic that spread across North America, which had immobilized Boston's fire department's horses. As a result, all the fire equipment had to be pulled to the fire by teams of volunteers on foot. A new water system to replace the aging, small, and rusting pipes that existed was barely underway in 1872. Fire departments from around New England responded gallantly to the fire, but when they arrived, their hoses did not fit Boston's fire hydrants. And the last, almost funny if it wasn't so sad, fact was that there was a huge party to celebrate the re-election of Ulysses S. Grant to the presidency. It had been underway at the Revere House, rendering many of the usual able-bodied men a bit indisposed to fight the fire initially. This panoramic photo is very dramatic. It shows Washington Street on the right side. Fire transmitted from one building to the other, from ash spewing from chimneys like volcanoes. The intense heat of the flames also passed through the partition walls and communicated to the next buildings. The memorial history described what was seen from Fort Hill. Quote, between it and the flames was Pearl Street, solidly built with handsome granite stores, where the shoe trade of the city had its headquarters. It happened that the fire attacked the whole street at once. Hardly 5 minutes elapsed after the appearance, to those watching from the Fort Hill space, of the first spark in one of the stores, before the whole block was a mass of roaring fire. In as little time as it requires to read this account, the walls grew red hot. The floor timbers began to fall against the walls, and the great structures tottered and fell like a house of cards with a thundering crash. Damn, that's good writing. Also, from the Memorial History of Boston, which was published 8 years later, the city was grandly illuminated, and a wild shower of burning brands and cinders was passing over the district, which was shortly to be devastated. The crash of falling walls became an almost continuous roar. The streets were filled as they were rarely at midday, with men and teams carrying away portable goods to a place of safety. The fire was raging out of control, leading the fire chief to authorize a daring plan. He would let the postmaster general, a former Civil War general, to use demolitions to blow up the buildings in the path of the blaze. It worked, but with that success came the devastation of streets like Devonshire, shown here after the fire. Meanwhile, fire departments from every state in New England were arriving on trains carrying pumpers and more firefighters. The fire was in Boston, but it had an effect on the entire metropolitan area. Special trains bearing fire equipment had been sent out from the suburbs and even those neighboring states. Flying flakes of heated granite and slate drifted all over the city. South Boston residents threw wet blankets over their roofs to save their homes. The sunset on November 10th was colored by the ash and the glow of the fire. It was so colored the view that a flock of flying ducks were mistaken for a meteor shower. In South Abington, 21 miles south of Boston, a burnt $50 bill was picked up by a local resident. And people as far north as Portland could see the glow of the fire on the horizon, which is just amazing. From another account, we read, the wild excitement of that terrible night and day had unstrung the nerves of the strongest. Thousands upon thousands of people had seen their property consumed or been thrown out of employment for how long, nobody could guess. The lawless had taken full advantage of their opportunity, and many men not habitual criminals had been tempted too strongly by the chance to pilfer. That's why regiments like the Chelsea Veterans Company assembled here in Boston after the blaze was put out to patrol the area. The whole community was on the verge of panic. No time was lost taking measures to reinforce the police, who were not numerous enough for the emergency. A cordon of guards was stationed completely around the burnt district. The Old South was to be ready again, devoted to military purposes, and became a barrack. Harper's Weekly printed a number of sketches of the fire, wrote that, quote, from Summer Street north nearly to State Street, and from Washington Street east to the water's edge, with 2 or 3 small exceptions, there is nothing but rubbish remaining of the hundreds of granite 9 structures. It's another view of Devonshire at its intersection with Franklin, showing more of the devastated leveled city as well as an old pumper. A new and much more functional and artistic business area would rise up from the ashes of the old. Mark Twain, in his Life on the Mississippi, wrote, quote, "The burnt district of Boston was commonplace before the fire, but now there is no commercial district in any city in the world that can surpass it or perhaps rival it in beauty, elegance, and tastefulness." Extensive alterations were made in the street lines. Suffolk Street was extended to Tremont and became the northern end of Shawmut Avenue. The total cost of improvements was not far from about $2.5 million, and the work was substantially finished by May of 1872. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of the fire, many Bostonians saw an opportunity to rethink the layout of the city. The street commissioners and the Joint Committee on Streets wanted to take the whole area by eminent domain. In fact, just 3 days after the fire was put out, the city surveyor had produced a plan for a new street pattern. But this was the 1870s, and there were many, many issues that would take decades, a century to be resolved. Questions that included the place or the right of government to build and redevelopment. Many owners worried they would not be able to afford property in the newly rebuilt area. And in the end, even the seemingly simple and necessary plan for widening many of the streets became embroiled in controversy. The governor called for the issuing of low interest loans, 5% payable in gold in 15 years, to help businesses in the burned out district. But the act was declared unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court. A law authorizing the formation of new insurance companies was enacted, as were other laws regarding insurance. A slew of fire laws were finally enacted. The best part was that they had enforceable penalties. The state also created a Department of Inspectional Services with the power to heavily fine those who did not follow the new building and fire codes. Many of the leather, boot, dry goods, and shoe businesses, by the way, if you ever smell leather burning, it must have stunk in this town. Many of them moved south to the area where South Station would be built, in an area that came to be known as the Leather District. Limited to 4 stories here in the Burnt District, many owners preferred moving to sections of the city where there would be no height requirements. And so the commercial district changed in character as insurance firms, banks, and brokerage houses moved into the new 4-story buildings. The Great Fire of 1872 in Boston destroyed 776 buildings, killed 13 people, including 2 men from Ladder Company 4, and led to the appointment of a board of fire commissioners. After the Chicago fires of 1871, the people of Boston responded with almost $500,000 in relief funds. A year later, when Boston suffered its fire, the city of Chicago offered to return the unused portion of the money, which Boston refused. The Great Fire of 1872 wasn't the last big fire, but even the Roxbury conflagration, which destroyed 216 buildings, including the fire station in 1894, couldn't compare in scope or intensity. And with the coming of the new century, those huge great fires of the city's 3 centuries were a thing of the past. Sitting on Piedmont Street in what was then Boston's South End was a nightclub. It was known as the Cocoanut Grove. The Cocoanut Grove was one of Boston's most popular night spots. You can all see that, I hope.
Yes.
Okay. Again, my apologies, everybody. So, um, here in what was then the South End was the Coconut Grove nightclub, one of Boston's most popular nightclubs. It was packed to the gills on the night of November 28th, 1942. Now, remember, this is almost exactly a year since Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II. Yet the club was still packed. Turns out that afternoon was the um, was the Boston College Holy Cross game. Boston College was heavily favored. They lost that game. And so a lot of the celebrants who were going to come here to the Coconut Grove decided they were not in much of a mood to party, which is probably a good thing. Here at the Coconut Grove, as you can see, there was a main ballroom, a dance floor, a fellow named Mickey Albert. He was the house band. He also happened to be a part owner of the Coconut Grove. If you look over on the left side of this picture, down by Piedmont Street, you'll see in black with white letters the words Melody Lounge. It was located downstairs of the Coconut Grove, and it was um, kind of a place where people went to go before they went upstairs to dancing, perhaps having a pre-dance cocktail. I wish I knew who these people were. This is just an unknown photograph of some people who had come to the Coconut Grove, perhaps to see the man in the tuxedo. That's Mickey Albert. As I mentioned, we are now in the era of World War II, and we can see in this clearly set up publicity photograph, Mr. Albert is entertaining some of our boys in uniform. That's Mr. William Shea. This rather imposing gentleman, he anchored the bar down here at the Melody Lounge. Now, what is about to happen is steeped in controversy, even to this day. A couple in the corner of the Melody Lounge, seeking privacy, unscrewed a light bulb, which was inside a plastic frond. They had fake palm trees, as you can see, littered all over the nightclub. And they wanted to get a little cozy, so he unscrewed the light bulb. Well, a busboy, a waiter, was told by the manager to please screw that light bulb back in. It was dark. He couldn't see. So he lit a match so he could see where the socket for the bulb was. It's never been absolutely proven that that was the moment. All anybody knows is within a minute, suddenly that corner of the Melody Lounge exploded. Those plastic fronds, those plastic trees, the crepe that was hanging on the walls, it was beautiful. It was brightly colored. All that stuff was highly flammable. And the next thing anybody knew, before anybody could really react, this rush of flame came pouring from up underneath the club from the Melody Lounge and burst into the main dance floor. Inside the club, it was sheer pandemonium. One of the things that the owner of the club, a man named Wolanski, did was to make sure that patrons would not sneak out without paying their bar tab. He had the doors, which should have been opening out here to Piedmont Street, he had them locked, had them chained closed. So as the fire began to spread and patrons tried to make their way out of the club, the only place they could get out was through a set of revolving doors on Shawmut Street. Have you ever gone through a revolving door with more than one, maybe two people? Tragically, bodies began to pile up outside that revolving door.
Seen that, so
Okay.
it's good. It's fine.
Okay. Um, this is the scene outside the club within a few minutes of the beginning of the fire. In fact, there was a ladder company that was only a block away attending to a car fire when the alarm came out that there was a fire just down the street at the Coconut Grove. Now, what's interesting to me is my father, who had grown up in New York, he grew up in the Bronx. Um, like everyone else around the country, he had heard about the Coconut Grove fire. What most impacted him was that this man, Buck Jones, who was his favorite cowboy star, was at the Coconut Grove and died in the fire. This is Mickey Alpert, who had barely escaped the fire, being assisted outside by some of the other patrons. Some of the stories of escape are truly remarkable. Several people found that there was a window outside the bathroom, in one of the bathrooms, and they began helping hoisting people through the window out into the street. One man recalled that there was a woman who was reticent to go through that window because, quote, she said she had forgotten her fur coat back at the table and she wanted to go get it. He was, let's just say, he used more than a few expletives to suggest to her that there were things more important than a GD fur coat. He eventually got her out the window. Other stories of heroism that that just break your heart. This gentleman who is carrying a victim to a cab was a soldier. And I'm very sorry, folks. His name was Harry Holbrook. And Harry gallantly and bravely went back into the Coconut Grove 3 times to help rescue people. He went in a 4th time and never came out. Now, I have a family story related to my wife's family that I want to share with you. So the fire is happening at the Grove, and they're starting to bring people out, and they needed to get them to either Mass General or to Boston City. Not having enough ambulances, the police began commandeering cabs, taxis. My wife's grandfather was one of those taxi drivers, and he was enlisted or volunteered to ferry people from Piedmont Street to either the Boston City Hospital or to Mass General. And many of them would survive because they had gotten to the hospital and gotten to care quick enough. Okay, we flash forward 30 years temporarily. My wife's grandmother was in her apartment in Charlestown cooking when she reached her hand over the stove. The sleeve caught fire, and luckily her grandfather was there. He tamped out the fire, but she was badly burned. He took her to Mass General, where he 30 years earlier had taken all of these fire victims, and his wife's life was saved by some of the same methods that were learned this night here at because of the Coconut Grove. Another incredibly tragic story is that of Clifford Johnson. He was another military man who was caught in the Coconut Grove and was badly burned over 80% of his body. It took months of, uh, of, of treatments, many of which were basically learned on the fly here at Mass General. And he eventually was well enough to be released from the hospital. He even married one of his nurses. I don't know if it's either one of these two young ladies. And he went back to Missouri. Now comes the tragically ironic part, which is that several months later, Clifford Johnson was killed when his Jeep overturned and burned, and he perished in that fire. The Coconut Grove fire only lasted 15 minutes. Think about it. 492 people died in only 15 minutes. And most of them were actually not burned. Most of them suffered from smoke inhalation. The panic outside the Coconut Grove, you can see this photograph showing a patron trying to see if he recognizes this victim who is being carried out of the Coconut Grove. And there's a priest over there on the right side. He is giving this poor woman her last rites. Boston City Hospital was one of the places where the victims were taken. For a while, they say that there was a new patient brought in about every 15 seconds for a couple of hours. This is Sophie Urban. She was one of the lucky ones. She did survive her ordeal at the Coconut Grove. Notice on her forehead, a letter has been written in lipstick. That's the letter M to let the doctors know that she had been given her dose of morphine. And this is a picture of the switchboard here at Boston City. Again, with so many patients coming in, news organizations, worried relatives and friends, they were completely swamped. Eventually, bodies were taken here to the Southern Mortuary and placed here into the morgue amphitheater, where they were then allowed the opportunity to try to identify the victims. And many of them some were unidentifiable. As you can see, this photograph of the coffins that had been brought over to the Southern Mortuary to then bring the victims to the cemeteries where they would be finally interred. This is the young man. This is the young waiter, busboy, who lit that match by that palm frond, and he testified at the inquest, but again, lacking any direct confirmation, he was never charged with starting the fire. Bernard Wolanski, however, was convicted not just of operating an unsafe nightclub, but it turns out that Mr. Wolanski had been, quote, in tight with the mayor and in tight with some of the building inspectors, had paid them off so they would look the other way, especially when it came to the doors here at the Coconut Grove being locked. So, what did we learn? Hopefully, we learned something from this tragedy, and we did. Laws were passed that combustible materials could not be used for decorations or in building components. that occupancy limit requirements should be strictly enforced, that exits needed to be kept clear of instructions and plainly marked, and public assembly buildings must have two separate means of egress, removed from each other. That means on opposite sides of the venue. And exit doors should always swing out towards the street, away from the inside of the building. Did we learn? Well, in 2003, the Station nightclub fire killed 100 plus people. Why? Because the doors were not were locked. They did not open outward. They were to the street. Combustible decorations, and also it didn't help that they were lighting fireworks inside a building where there was all that combustible material. So it's especially tragic to me that, and this is kind of the theme, we go back to 1631 when they started passing those ordinances, and they kept ignoring those ordinances and people died. Okay. Our last fire begins here at the corner of Commonwealth Avenue and Dartmouth Street here in Boston. This is the Hotel Vendome. It was built in two segments. First, by architect William Gibbons Preston in 1871. The second by J.F. Ober in 1881. So the front section was built in 1871, and this side piece, the one that's along Dartmouth, and you can see the awning down there by the horse-drawn cart, that was built about 10 years later. This was the first building with electric lighting, which was installed by Thomas Edison himself. And one of its more notable guests was President Grover Cleveland. He stayed here at the Vendome when he was president. Now, in 1972, the Hotel Vendome was going to be refurbished and converted into condominiums. Work was proceeding here at the Vendome when around 2:00 in the afternoon, some workers noticed smoke was coming from the upper floors, and a fire alarm went off, and immediately from right around the corner, ladder 33, and forgive me, I think it's engine 16 and ladder 33 came around the corner from from Boylston Street here to the Vendome. The fire quickly raged out of control, and before long, 5 alarms were rung, and fire trucks and equipment from all over the city converged here on the Vendome. The fire was put out about 5:00, 5:15 in the afternoon. The fire had been put out, and so firemen began the job of going back into the building and just making sure that there were no other embers, no fires that they might have missed, any hidden fires that they would have to take care of. And they were in the process of doing that when at 5:28 on the afternoon of June 17th, 1972, the back section, that second section that was built in 1881, collapsed. There were firefighters who had literally just crossed over the threshold from the old section of the Vendome to that new 1881 section, when suddenly the whole thing collapsed. Firefighters immediately rushed to the collapse, some of them grabbing at rocks and bricks and other building materials to get at their comrades who were trapped under the rubble. Several men did survive the collapse and were pulled out. This photo, you'll forgive me, but when I look at this truck from Engine 15, this ladder truck covered in the rubble, I can't help but be reminded of the loss of life at the World Trade Center towers, where hundreds of firefighters were killed when that tower collapsed. Here at the Vendome, there were 9 firefighters who were lost when the back of the Vendome collapsed. And these are the men who gave their lives to Boston and to the Vendome on June 17th, 1972. There is a memorial that, even with some Back Bay reticence, was finally erected here across the street from the Vendome. I wrote a piece in the Boston Globe about this memorial, and it was called the Vendome test. And this was described to me by a Boston firefighter. So every once in a while, there is a new class of fire recruits, and they go through their training and they are vetted, and it's made sure that they have the physical stamina and the strength to be able to do all the things that firefighters need to do. But there's one more test that they're given before they are actually inducted to members of the Boston Fire Department. They're taken here to the memorial at Calm Ave and Dartmouth. And they're told about the Vendome fire and the capriciousness of fate, how those 9 men, wrong place, wrong time, gave their lives for the community and for their profession. Each one of those recruits is then told, you can have a subway fare back home if you want to back out. Nobody will think the less of you if this is a risk that you want to take. And what my firefighter friend told me is that there's no recruit that has ever taken their cab fare home. So, folks, I'm very sorry about the glitch we had, but I'm glad we were able to muddle through. I see I'm going to turn my video back on.
And do you want to stop sharing your screen?
I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to say, hi, everybody. Thanks again for sticking with me. And I guess we'll take questions. And I want to hear from some of our attendees. Thank you. I see all the lovely, the hearts and the thumbs up. Thank you very much. And the
My favorite
applause.
about
I
it.
love emojis. They're just, but so who's going to, I want to hear some of these stories
Yeah.
about relatives who were at the, the Cocoanut Grove, or maybe someone who knows someone who was at the Vendome as well. I'd like to hear from, let's share that.
Okay, so Sandra said, before I get to questions, I'll read some of these. And I
Oh, wait,
opened
this
up,
is great.
yeah,
It's
I
true what
opened
they
up
say. I'm sorry, dear.
I opened up the
All
chat so people
regulations.
can chat with each other again.
Okay, okay,
So
thank you.
Sandra said, my mother-in-law was a nurse at the time of the Coconut Grove and had been called to Boston City Hospital to treat patients. Boston City had been training personnel to treat burn victims in case the city would be bombed by World War II.
That's right. Yeah, right. Same thing at Mass General. So they had lots of plasma and penicillin. And again, they learned a lot about how to treat burn victims from what happened at the Coconut Grove. And there's no question in some of the doctors' minds that many soldiers, both in the Pacific and the European theater, their lives were saved because of what was learned that night at the Cocoanut Grove.
Oh, wow. Stephen says the Station Night Club fire was in Rhode Island. The Hotel
Yes,
Vendome is in Boston's Back Bay. And
yes.
then Janet says that the Iroquois fire it was a
Oh my.
catastrophic fire in Chicago.
600 people died at the Iroquois Theater.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, awful.
Again, a flammable curtain somehow caught fire, and all of those decorations, all those wood scenery, and the theater was not properly set up for a mass exodus.
Hmm.
600 people.
I wonder how many of us are from firefighter families. My grandfather was a lieutenant for Waltham Fire
Oh.
Department. So yeah, just keep talking in the chat about who your connections to these fires. Remember, you can now click on everyone so everybody can see your comments.
Mm.
Um, Nancy says, I was born November 28th, 1942. My mom was at the Boston City Hospital. She would tell me about the victims that started to come into the hospital. She was left on her own in a room to have her baby. That was
Oh my goodness.
Nancy.
That's a new one, Nancy. Wow.
Oh my gosh, so many amazing stories here. Um, okay, let's get to some questions and you guys can keep putting your stories in and sharing them with each other and with us.
Oh,
Oh
wait a
my
minute. Hold
goodness.
this. You're uh Denise Clougherty, excuse me. Your grandfather was chief of the Boston Fire Department.
Wow,
Wow. Was
connections
he
here.
was he a chief at the time of this fire?
All right, let's find out.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so many fires to talk about. Denise, please, if you get a chance, answer the question,
Yeah.
let us know if he was,
Oh, someone's mentioning the Hartford Circus fire tragedy. That was that was another one, the circus tent, and I'm trying to remember. That's a couple of hundred people, I think that died in that fire.
wow. Okay, so Marianne wants to know, how was the debris in the first fire you talked about removed
Hmm.
from the burnt district of Boston without any equipment like today?
Horses and carts and just laborers. There's
Mhm.
plenty of people who were willing to make whatever pennies a day they were paying to haul all these rocks and debris.
Mhm. So Denise came back and said, yes, her grandfather was the fire chief during the Coconut Grove fire.
Wow.
Yeah, I think you're gonna have to
Did
talk to her.
Yeah, I would love to hear if there were any stories he passed along to her or wow.
Yeah. Let me see. Len says that according to his mother, they also commandeered private cars during the first.
Yeah, like my wife's grandfather's taxi cab. Yeah, and yeah.
Yep. Um, I was hoping you'd speak about the Luongo fire in East Boston. Do you know much about it that you could share?
Yeah, that was no interesting. Tragically, it took place about 2 weeks before the Coconut Grove. The Luongo was a another club. It was there in Maverick Square in East Boston. Um, the fire begins. The firefighters show up. They're dealing with the fire when one wall of the building in which the Luongo was located collapsed, and 6 firefighters died that day.
Mhm.
The story was front page news. Now imagine, again, it's less than a year since Pearl Harbor. World War II is obviously taking up a lot of space in the papers, but the Luongo was front page news until November 28th, and then the Coconut Grove took over the front pages for a number of weeks. In
Mhm.
fact, for 6 months, the Boston papers were still reporting on Coconut Grove's deaths as some of the patrons who were injured finally succumbed to the detriment of the inhalation or from their burns. Six
Mhm.
months.
Oh, wow. Oh, so there's a lot of interest in the college game. Nancy says, fact, this was not an ordinary college game. Boston College was a favorite to win the game and go to
Mm-hmm.
the Orange Bowl.
Yes.
In the comments, like while we were waiting earlier, Dimitri said BC had reserved the party of the Coconut Grove to celebrate the football win against Holy Cross. The night it was burnt down, Holy Cross ended up putting their backup quarterback, John Besemans, in since they expected to lose, and he scored 4 touchdowns. BC was too embarrassed to attend the party. And John Besemans was my great-granduncle.
See, these connections, they send chills down my spine. I thank you, everybody, for sharing all that, for sharing this stuff. It's
so, but in addition to that, Christine says, my aunt was one of the people who did not go to the Coconut Grove that night because BC lost to Holy Cross. She lived to be 92.
God bless. Wow.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Like I said, as soon as I announced that we were doing this talk, David, people started telling me their stories related to Coconut Grove.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's something that people really remember. So somebody says my aunt is I keep going back between aunt and aunt, so excuse me.
That's okay.
My aunt's first night as a nurse was at City Hospital that night. Also, are you aware that 60 years ago today was the Trumbull Street fire in the South End where 5 firemen died?
5 firefighters, yeah.
Yeah.
That was a toy factory down on Trumbull. Yeah. Tragic, yeah. Just 8 years before the Vendome.
JD asks, when were fire extinguishers first required to be kept in buildings serving the public?
I don't know the answer to that question. But given what the Station nightclub and other, fires, some businesses, doesn't matter what the rules are, they're not going to do them anyway. But yeah, I don't know that answer to that question.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the chat because there's some interesting comments here. Denise, whose grandfather is John Clougherty,
Wow.
who was fire chief at the Trumbull Street fire where his son was killed. John Clougherty was my husband's grandfather.
I have several friends who are firefighters. And when I was originally looking at the story of the Vendome, I ended up writing something for the Globe and then something for History Magazine. What impressed me is you look at the Luongo fire, and there were men who went to the Luongo who knew some of those 6 men who were killed that day. They stayed on the force, and then they were at Trumbull Street. Then 5 men get killed at Trumbull Street. Men who were at the Vendome might have been at where I know actually for a fact that some of them, the ladders and engines who showed up at Vendome had men who were at Trumbull. So, these guys and women now who know the risks, who saw it with their own eyes at Trumbull Street, at Luongo, but they went into that building anyway, knowing full well what the consequences might be. God bless them all.
I just saw, I think I was on CBS this morning, they had a story about 9/11. Same thing. The firefighters were told, you don't have to do this, you can leave, and not a single one took that out.
Nope.
Nobody, I mean, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Let's see. Both parents, Johanna says, both parents were on their way from Worcester to attend the after party at the Coconut Grove, supposedly arrived at the time things were breaking out or already had. They said they just turned around and left. Had no idea what was really happening.
Yeah.
So chilling.
And those stories about like the Boston College team and all their supporters, if that backup quarterback maybe hadn't have thrown 4 touchdown passes, how many different other people would have been at the Coconut Grove and suffered at that fire? Again, fate has so much to do. It's so capricious, and it's chilling to think about the difference between where you could be and where you actually were at a particular event.
I just want to mention that one of our attendees, Barbara, put her email in the chat, and it's because she's a CGF Memorial on the CGF Memorial Committee. I'm a nurse documenting the stories of the nurses. And they're going to have a permanent memorial next year. And this year they'll meet on the site at November 30th at 2 p.m. All are welcome to attend. And it's www.coconutgrove.org if anybody wants to check it out. So
and by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but somebody did mention there is a plaque behind what used to be the 57. That shows how long it's been since I was in Boston. But it's it's ironic that when you walk to the back of the 50, so what used to be the 57, um, which is where the Grove, the Coconut Grove was, you can see the doors with the panic bars, which is this legacy when people follow the rules, when the builders and the owners and the operators do what they're supposed to do, there's that legacy of what was learned from the Coconut Grove.
Mhm.
So I'm going to write that down because so coconutgrove.org.
Mhm.
Um,
With the A,
okay.
cocoa nut grove.
Yes.
Yes. Um, so that just makes me think of the nightclub fire, because wasn't that the case too? Was that the doors or something didn't work?
Yeah, that was part of it. Also, all that flammable material
Yeah. Yep.
and
Yep.
the setting of fireworks inside a building on a stage which had all that flammable material.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's tragic. My one of my friends lost a son. He was actually in the band and
Oh,
he died that night. So
I'm so sorry, David.
yeah, I know it was tragic. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
again,
any loss of life is, of course,
yeah.
when it brings us so close to home. I'm just gonna ask two more questions, if that's okay.
No, no, please.
Um,
We can have as many questions as you want.
okay.
This is
Feel
fascinating, and I just want to say I thank you to everybody who came tonight and has been sharing your stories. I would really love to hear more. Um, my website is davidkruh.com. So it's DAVIDKRUH.com. davidkruh.com. And there's a contact button. I would love to hear from you, and especially if you have a connection to the Coconut Grove, whether as as a relative who was there or wasn't there by some circumstance, was a nurse, a firefighter, somebody called into duty, like my wife's grandfather. I'd like to hear from you because this is what historians do. We collect these stories, and it's important. The more we tell these stories, maybe some of these SOBs who don't do the right thing will be compelled to do so.
Mhm. Well, that actually brings me to one of the questions. Vivian asks, what happened to the owner who had the doors locked with chains preventing escape?
So he was convicted, he was convicted again of violating all these fire laws. We find out later how he had was in tight with with the mayor's office, with the building inspectors. He was released early from prison because he got cancer. And when he was released, it's a very poignant, not that I really care about this guy, but what he said as he left the prison, knowing he was ravaged with cancer and was only going to last a few more months, he looked at the reporters and he said, I wish I had died with the others in the fire. So for whatever that's worth. So he was gone by 44, 45.
Hmm. Well, at least he didn't die of smoke inhalation in his
Well,
illness.
that would have been more, but anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, so Ralph asks, did the fire departments at any time fight? I'm sure they did. At any time fight for better fire safety requirements.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yep.
But they had to fight sometimes businesses, sometimes the community, people who said, well, why should we be doing this? But it's a constant uphill battle to get people to do the right thing.
Mhm. Joanna says there's a documentary called Six Locked Doors: The Legacy of Coconut Grove. Have you ever seen that?
I have not. I'm going to
Joanna,
write
we're
that
gonna have to
down
look for
too.
that.
We're going to have to look, you darn right. Six locked doors.
Yes. Which actually
Wow.
answers JD's question, was this Coconut Grove fire ever depicted in a feature film?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, maybe the documentary will, satisfy our curiosity about it.
Yeah, that's I'll have to
Oh,
I'll
okay.
definitely
So
look for that.
Joanna just put a link
Oh, look at
to,
it. Sixlockeddoors.com. Thank
yes.
you, Joanne.
Love it. And Barbara says there's 6 locked doors can be found at a website, but I don't actually have that link. So I think this link works.
That would be okay. Well, we'll certainly try it. There we go. Excuse me.
Excellent. I feel like
Yeah.
you have enough for a second book or
I've got
something.
homework here, folks. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, amazing. So
Please.
somebody did ask if what other major fires you know about. And it sounds like from our conversation now that you know about a lot of different fires throughout the country.
Um, no, I wouldn't consider myself. I mean, I made myself familiar with some of these Boston uh, fires,
Hmm.
and I just because I don't know, I knew about the Iroquois, I knew about the circus fire, but no, I'm not an expert in that field
Oh,
necessarily.
okay.
Chelsea fires, 1973, devastated a large portion of the city. Somebody's I see just posted about that. Yeah, that was one hell of a fire.
Yep. And the dance club and the Charles, somebody else mentioned that earlier too. Um, some were arson. Was the dance club arson or Chelsea fires?
I don't know. I don't know what the cause was.
Okay. And the Shirtwaist Factory, of course.
Oh, well, yes, 1903. That was
Hmm.
the all those young girls who were trapped in the building.
You did not explain Jack and Spark.
Oh, I thought I had. A spark is just, for lack of a better word, a fan of fires. Somebody who is not a professional firefighter or reporter, but who goes to fires and maybe takes pictures, records the event just for their own edification. And a Jake is a fire person. And there's several ways that people describe where the word Jake comes from. The one that I adhere to is the keys that were put into the fire boxes so that they could be alerted, from the fire boxes. They would ring back at the fire stations. They were shaped, looked like the letter J, so they were called J keys or Jakes for short.
Oh my gosh.
That's where
Jay,
that comes from.
Jay says that the head of the Boston arson ring of the 1980s was the head of the state police fire marshal's office. Oh my gosh.
I think someone just backed me up on the Jakes. I
Yeah,
saw a little.
yeah.
Okay.
Jakes
Okay.
become Sparks after they retire.
Oh, okay.
It's funny.
There they
So,
go.
yeah, so Jay said that, let me see, let me get back to the head of the Boston arson ring of the 1980s was the head of the state police fire marshal's office, and they set 2,500 fires.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
And Ron wants to know if you will be willing to travel to the Linfield for their historical society. I will send everybody David's website information where you can contact him.
Yes. The answer, by the way, is yes. Linfield's. I'm in Reading, so it's
Oh,
next door. And in fact, I've been to the Linfield Historical Society. I'd love to go there again. Please, yeah, go to davidcrew.com and there's a contact button there.
okay. Wow, lots and lots of information.
Yeah.
David,
Wow.
thank
I'm
you so
overwhelmed.
much.
I'm overwhelmed, by the way, how many people came. And you folks, thank you for sharing. And again, my apologies for our little glitch, but it all came out great, didn't it?
I think it did.
Oh, well, thank you.
David, thank you again. Like I said, I think eighth time's a charm or something. But David has agreed to do another talk with us in April about the Boston Red Sox. And if you enjoyed tonight, you will definitely enjoy that. Um,
Despite what the way the Sox have been playing for the past 4 years, yes,
yeah.
I think we'll still have some. We'll do talk about the fun stuff.
Okay. All right. When we were winning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So thank you again, David, for tonight and for everybody who came and had such enthusiastic comments, even though it was somewhat sad. And of
Yeah.
course, your love of emojis is noted.
Wow. Yeah. Look at that.
I know. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a wonderful night. Good night,
Thank you,
David.
everybody. Good night.